Oh, wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Welcome. Thanks for taking the time to view the video. Real quick video. We're just going to read an article from this anthropological journal. It's called The American Anthropologist, published under the auspices of the Anthropological Society of Washington, Volume 2. This is from 1889. We go to page 133, and we're just going to be talking about the etymology of the word tobacco. So it's here by Dr. A. Ernst, Caracas, Venezuela. Without going into unnecessary detail, in regard to the absolutely groundless etymologies of the word tobacco, from the name of the island of Tobago or the Mexican town of Tabasco, we have the generally accepted opinion, based on the report of Oviedo, that the word tobacco originated in the name of the implement employed by the pre-Columbian inhabitants of Haiti, Haiti, for making use of the weed. The old historian says that they had the custom of taking some fumigations for the purpose of getting intoxicated, which they called tobacco, with the smoke of a certain herb, and from his brief description it would appear that this was the plant we know now by the same name. He then proceeds to describe the implement used in the operation, and gives also a rude figure of it, which is faithfully reproduced in the cut inserted here, taken from the original edition printed at Sevilla in 1535. It is a small tube in the shape of the letter Y. The stem was thrust into the smoke of the burning herb. The branches were put to the nostrils, and after repeated inhalations, a state of intoxication was produced, which lasted for some time. This implement, he says, they called tobacco, adding expressly that such was not the name of the herb, as some people believed. He finally declares that this very bad vice, este vicio muy malo, had already been adopted by some Spaniards, and by even more of the so-called Negro slaves. But what if the Spaniards were Negro too? So these words mean something else. Who said that it took away their feeling of fatigue, les quita el cansancio. Continuing, I infer after a careful consideration of his text that Oviedo himself never saw an Indian using the little implement he describes and figures, and that he confused with the old custom imperfectly known to him by mere hearsay, the one which in his time was already practiced by some of his own countrymen. I shall prove presently that he is certainly right in giving the name tobacco, or more correctly, taboca, to the Y-shaped inhaler. His former statement that the fumigations were called so is to be traced to another source, as will be shown further on. The taboca is indeed the same instrument, which is still in use among several tribes on the South American continent for the absorption of certain exciting powders, niopo, parica, and specimens of it are to be seen in most ethnographical collections. It is, however, not used as a smoke inhaler, nor can it be effectually employed for this purpose, as I have convinced myself by repeated experiments with burning tobacco leaves. I do not believe, therefore, that the Haitians inhaled in this manner the smoke of any herb, but I suppose they used the taboca, precisely like many South American Indians, for absorbing some exciting powder. Hmm. This certainly may have been that of a dried tobacco leaves, mixed perhaps with some other substance, as I am not quite sure that the physiological effect of pure tobacco powder would be of the intensity which Oviedo indicates. This word, taboca, is of Guarani origin. Martius alleges that such is the name of the tube, generally made of one of the long bones of the tapir. Listen, tapir, through the which the muras and maujes of the Amazon reciprocally blow into each other's nostril. The parica, a powder very much like the niopo of the Guajibos of the upper Orinoco, if not exactly the same thing. All right, you guys hear that? So we got ancient Americans, sniffing some type of powder up their nose. All right, we ain't, doesn't seem like they're talking about the coca plant or cocaine, something else, but they're not really being specific either. All right, it says in Guarani, taboca is also the name of a tall bambusa Kios or Sachios grass, the hollow internodes of which were probably employed for the purpose mentioned before the more refined use of the bones of the tapir became a fashion. Almeida Noguera derives taboca either from tabog, the permissive form of the verb bog, I split, or from itabog, a split stone, as the Indians are said to have used pieces of the cane by the addition of water for grinding holes into stones which they wanted to divide or to cut in a certain direction. Parica and niopo are prepared from the pods and seeds of some species of leguminaceous trees. Piptadenia niopo. The powder has not yet been studied chemically, but Mr. Vicente Marcano of this city, who brought a certain quantity of it from his voyage to the upper Orinoco, tells me that from a preliminary investigation of its properties, he is led to believe that it contains a powerful alkaloid. These trees do not grow everywhere, so that some tribes were compelled to look for other substances producing similar effects, and it appears that the leaves of the tobacco were amongst them, as is proved by the existence of the old Guarani word petiqui or petingui, which is translated by Almeida Nogueira with po or powder de tabaco para ser aspirado. This custom, however, is limited to the tribes of the widespread Guaranian family. At least I have been unsuccessful in finding its practice mentioned amongst the peoples of Arawak origin. The niopo inhaler of the Guajibos, as well as the instrument described and figured by Oviedo, are certainly but further improvements of the simple bone tube of the muras and maujes, and as there can be no doubt that taboca could easily be changed into tobacco, it is evident that Oviedo is right with respect to the etymology of this word. There is another word, for example, cojoba or cohiba, connected with the custom referred to. Bachiller y Morales thinks it was the old Antillean name of the tobacco plant. It has been preserved by Las Casas in chapter, all right, that was that, guys, 150, let me see. I'm guessing here, 166, I don't know, of his Apologetica Historia. After the describing the manner in which the Haitian Indians absorbed through their noses a certain powder by means of an instrument like the one mentioned by Oviedo, he adds, estos polvos y estas ceremonias o actos se llamaban cojoba en su lenguaje. He's saying these ceremonies, of them, inhaling or sniffing the powder was called cojoba in their language. It is very probable that the powder was made of tobacco leaves, but the word cojoba appears to me of Guarani origin, just like the word taboca. At the very first glance, it looks like a compound of coke to sustain, strengthen, nourish, and hope, leaf, so that it would be the same as the modern Brazilian word cojonga. Example, the leaf which sustains or strengthens. There is, however, still another way of explaining its meaning, which agrees exactly with the quoted statement of Las Casas, that cohoba was the name not only of the powder, but also of the ceremony or act of taking the powder. Cui in Guarani means powder. Cuiu or cuyu is therefore to eat or to absorb a powder. The present participle of this verb would be cuiguabo, or also cuyubo, and cuyubo could easily be transformed into cohobo or cohoba. The present participle has in Guarani frequently the sense of a noun, so that cuyubo means the absorbing or taking of the powder, precisely as Las Casas says. Here, however, arise two questions. How came these Guarani words taboca and cohoba to the Antilles, and was the former really used in reference to the smoking of tobacco? Guarani words are not at all uncommon in the original languages of the Antilles, as I have shown by a considerable number of terms having reference to the culture and manifold uses of the mandioca plant. But the cultivation of this plant spread from Brazil northward, and it is but natural to assume that its local name went with it until both reached the climatic limit of the plant. A similar assertion cannot be maintained with respect to the use of tobacco in the larger Antilles, where at least one species of nicotiana is indigenous, and the custom of smoking appears to have been introduced either from the north or the northwest. The existence of Guarani words in Haiti having any connection with this custom is therefore not so easily to be accounted for. Maybe there's relations there, right? It seems to me, however, that a clue may be found in the statement made by Las Casas that in a certain region of the northern part of Haiti, there lived two tribes, the Siguayos and Masorillas, who spoke a language or languages totally different from the one used in the remainder of the island. Of the first, he says, they called themselves Siguayos because they wore their hair very long, as in our Castile do the women. Now, this name, Siguayos, is a genuine Guarani word with a Spanish ending, composed of the transitive verb sig, to clip, to cut, round, and the negation, a, so that it has exactly the meaning alluded to by Las Casas. He further observed that this people did not call the gold caona, which is Carib, but tuop. Here again we have a Guarani word, Itayu, literally Yellowstone. The name Masorillas, or perhaps Mosarillas, is almost identical with the Guarani Emboacailla, Emboacailla, to have watery eyes, to be Blair-eyed, an epithet which is met also elsewhere as an ethnographical denomination. It follows, herefore, or herefrom, that there lived in northern Haiti at least one tribe that spoke a language of Guaranian stock, which was different from the general language used in that island. All right, different peoples there in Haiti. The Siguayos must have come from the South American continent, following, in all probability, the Arawaks, when these were partially driven from the mainland. Not being very numerous, they were pushed by their hostile neighbors as far north as the country allowed, until they finally maintained their ground against their enemies. This, of course, cannot be proved as a historical fact, but I think it would be difficult to give a better reason for the existence of those isolated tribes in the north of Haiti. These people were no doubt acquainted with the use of some exciting powder and had their tabocas, which they went on using in their new home. But then it is evident that they did not smoke tobacco, but used it as a snuff, or they sniffed it, listen. And so we arrive at the same conclusion. Example, that Oviedo's reports refers not to smoking, but to the absorption of tobacco powder through the nose. This circumstance does not disprove the derivation of the word tobacco from taboca, but we have other and older testimony for the smoking of tobacco, from which a different origin of the word may be deduced. The Spanish discoverers of the New World had in Cuba, in the first days of November 1492, the earliest opportunity of seeing Indians in the act of smoking tobacco. All right, we're gonna get that account right for the dismount today. The earliest opportunity of seeing Indians in the act of smoking tobacco, although the dried leaves of this plant had already been noticed some days before, October 15th, among the cargo of a boat belonging to a native of one of the Bahama Islands. Under date of the 6th of November, the Journal of Columbus brings the first condensed report of smoking cigars. Las Casas gives a more detailed description of the habit, which he probably drew either from some writings of Columbus or from verbal information of eyewitnesses. He relates that the two men, who had been sent out by the admiral to reconnoiter the country, returned on Monday, the 5th of November, and reported, among other things, that they had seen on their way many Indians carrying firebrands in their hands and certain dried leaves rolled into another dry leaf, like the paper muskets the children make about Whitsuntide. At one end, these rolls were lighted, and at the other, the Indians sucked at them so as to inhale the smoke together with the air, whereby they comforted their limbs and got almost intoxicated, saying that it took away their weariness. These muskets, he adds, or what else we may name them, they call tabacos. Here we evidently have a description of smoking cigars, just as we smoke them, and we find in accordance with Oviedo's first statement that the burning leaves in a particular shape were called tabacos. In this latter circumstance, I see a proof that Oviedo was acquainted with the original of the Journal of Columbus or some other report left by Admiral from which Las Casas made the abstract published by Navarrete. To the same source point, in my opinion, the following words in Oviedo's narration. They burned the leaves of that herb after having them bundled or wrapped up, like the pages at the court blow out their puffs of smoke. There can be no doubt that Las Casas knew the first part of Oviedo's work, printed at Seville in 1535, as he mentions it several times in his own Historia, which he began to write in 1552. He was, however, not the man to copy from an author with whom he had had rather serious quarrels in 1519 at Barcelona about his favorite idea in regard to the manner of treating the Indians, and it is even singular that he lost the opportunity of pointing out the incongruities in Oviedo's report concerning the matter in question. I believe, therefore, that both drew from the same sources, but that Oviedo unfortunately mixed up those older records referring to Cuba with what he heard at Santo Domingo about the former use of tobacco in Haiti. One thing is certain, that all events, example the word tobacco, was not the name of the plant universally so called now. All right, you guys didn't, if you didn't know that, well, that's what seems to be the history. Unfortunately, we know very little of the language or languages spoken in Cuba before the Spaniards set their feet upon the pearl of the Antilles, and this little is to a great extent apocryphal. Apocryphal, Cuba. Didn't Columbus said they were speaking like Hebrews? Some respectable authorities, however, believe that in one part at least, the language was of the Arawak branch, and I shall adopt this view as a working hypothesis in order to ascertain whether it leads to an acceptable interpretation of the word tobacco quoted by Las Casas. I do not think that it came from Haiti. The Indian languages, poor as they are in many respects, are nevertheless very rich in terms referring to everyday life. It is therefore inconceivable that in Cuba they should have adopted the name of a particular instrument, which perhaps they did not use, for something quite different. In order to solve the pending problem, we must not forget that the word tobacco, as written by the Spaniards, is probably not a faithful rendering of the term used by the Indians. We ought likewise to remember that colloquial intercourse between the Indians and the European discoverers at the time could be but exceedingly limited, amounting to little ease than a kind of gesture language, giving origin to many capital mistakes and false interpretations. Let us suppose, then, that a smoking Indian was asked by one of Columbus' messengers, who at the same time pointed to his cigar, "What is this?" or "What do you call this?" If the former altogether guessed the general meaning of the inquiry, he might as well understand, "What are you doing there?" And then his answer very naturally would have been, I am smoking, or I will smoke. This phrase in modern Arawak would be datukupa, which is the first person singular in the future tense of the verb atukun, to eat, sucking, for instance, fruits, used also either with or without the noun juli, tobacco, for to smoke tobacco. Quite in the same manner the lower classes say in Spanish chupar tabaco, to suck tobacco, right? The objective noun being sometimes dropped when the meaning is sufficiently clear from other circumstances. The future tense of Arawak verbs is generally formed by dropping the final n and adding the termination pa, but there are instances where this syllable is incorporated in the word, probably in consequence of a metaplasmic change, a feature extremely common in most American languages. If we perform this transposition in the word datukupa, we obtain dakupaku, and as the first syllable has a very dead sound, it would be very likely that a foreign ear lost it altogether, so that tupaku remained, which is almost identical with tabaco. This etymology, methinks, is quite acceptable, both phonetically and logically. And if so, it would appear that the Arawak hypothesis, after all, is not so groundless as its opponents allege. The Spaniards, of course, never thought of inquiring into the real meaning of the word, which was to them a matter of no interest whatever. Those comparatively small bands of adventurers who opened the gates of the New World adopted unhesitatingly any name, whether right or wrong, they heard or believed they heard, for the many new and strange productions of an exuberant nature which pressed on them at every step. We may thus understand how it resulted that the word tobacco came soon to be so universally used for this most important commodity that it superseded altogether the real name which the inhabitants of the Antilles had for the plant, so that the latter is not even once mentioned in the profuse writings of Oviedo, Las Casas, and other historians of the Spanish conquest in the West Indian Islands. All right, and that's the end of this article. Again, real quick, just wanted to go over the history just in case you didn't know. It seems that the word tobacco doesn't really come from the actual plant. It's not the indigenous word for the actual plant itself. There must have been a different word used by the American Indians to refer to tobacco. But tobacco seems to have been the instrument that they were, again, sniffing the powder. Tobacco mixed with probably other herbs and whatever else, that's what they use. The tabaca, tabaco, or tabaca, tobacco. All right. So I hope you enjoyed it. For the dismount, we're going to go to a throwback real quick. We're going to get that source that we're talking about when Columbus and the Spaniards were referring to people smoking. But I'm going to point something out because it does literally say they're using the tobacco leaf, right, or whatever. They're almost describing it. And then they're saying they're rolling up herbs, right? But we'll get that from the book so you guys can see it yourself. Hope you found this little etymology info interesting about tobacco. Continuing with the book A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus by Washington Irving, and we're in Cuba, talking about when he was there. And it says here, on their way back, they're talking about the Spaniards, right? They, for the first time, witnessed the use of a weed. Now listen to this, which the indigenous caprice of man has since converted into an universal luxury. In the defiance of the opposition of the senses, they beheld several of the native going about with firebrands in their hands and certain dried herbs. Dried herbs, so we're talking about a weed. Now we're talking about dried herbs, which they rolled up. They rolled it up in a leaf, right? In a leaf, and lighting one end, put the other in their mouths, and continued exhaling and puffing out the smoke. So they were rolling up
rolling up some herbs, right? Some dried herbs, weed that he just said, and they're explaining how they were puffing it, smoking it up, exhaling, puffing out the smoke. These rolls they called tobacco, so it was rolled in a tobacco leaf, but it was herbs they were rolling. They weren't smoking tobacco; they were just using the tobacco leaf to roll up herbs. Now, whether that's cannabis, marijuana, most likely, but I know that they also smoked other herbs, Native American or American natives, like sage and other herbs also, not just marijuana, all right? But over here we see a clear description of what they were doing, and they're clearly telling you what it is, dried herbs. A name since transferred to the plant which they were made.
Since remotest antiquity, man has tried to speak to his gods through symbols. One could place a gift before an altar, a sacred object, the dwelling place of any of the nearby deities. But how might one reach aloft to the heavens, to the distant gods of the moon, the stars, and the sun? In the Western Hemisphere, long before the arrival of the white man, smoke from burning herbs ascended to the heavens, carrying with it the prayers and the desires of the Indian. What he could not touch with his hand, he sought to reach with incense, and the smoke itself was believed to have mystical powers of protection and healing. The ceremonial altars in which tobacco and certain other herbs were burned took many forms. The most primitive container was probably a simple concave stone, or a depression in the ground made by removing the turf so that the virgin soil was exposed. Incense was also formed by puffing on hollow tubes filled with burning tobacco. At some point in time, now lost to history, a hollow shaft and a stone bowl were fitted together to form a simple pipe. The importance of the pipe in the ritual life of the Indian is revealed in the legends handed down from generation to generation, as in this Plains Indian story about the origin of the first pipe.
One day, as two men were hunting on the prairie, a beautiful woman dressed in white buckskin appeared before them and said she had come to talk to their chief, Standing Hollowhorn. When all the people had gathered in a great lodge, the sacred woman entered, walked sunwise around the lodge, and stood before the chief. Holding up a bundle, she told him she bore a gift from the Great Spirit. Then, as all eyes watched her, she untied the bundle and drew forth a magnificent pipe. Its bowl was of red stone and symbolized their mother, the earth. Carved in the stone was a buffalo calf, which stood for all of the four-legged animals who lived upon the earth. The wooden stem represented all that grew on the earth, and the 12 hanging feathers, the winged things in the skies. The woman warned Standing Hollowhorn to treasure this sacred gift because it stood for all the people and all the things in the universe. Each of their voices would join his when he offered up incense to the Great Spirit, and with this pipe his people would prosper. Then, walking sunwise around the fire, she left. But after going a short distance, the woman looked back and sat down. And when she stood up, a cry of surprise was heard, for she had turned into a red and brown buffalo calf. The calf walked farther away, rolled over, and stared at the people. When it stood up, it became a white buffalo. Walking off toward the horizon, It again lay down and arose, this time all black in color. Then, bowing to each of the four corners of the universe, the buffalo disappeared beyond a hill.
From this mythical beginning, smoking was to spread to the far corners of the earth. But unlike those who later adopted the custom, the Aboriginal American never smoked for his own personal pleasure. Of the many types of pipes made by the Indian, none was more sacred than the calumet. Carefully fashioned after that first legendary pipe, it played an important role in many community functions. It was used to bring needed rain or favorable weather for a journey. It gave safe conduct to travelers. It served to formalize agreements, to placate hostile tribes, and to conclude a lasting peace. The word calumet is Norman French for tube or flute, particularly a shepherd's pipe. It originally referred to a highly symbolic reed shaft through which the life spirit of man was said to pass. When the French explorers first saw the ornate wooden pipe stems in America, they used this same term to describe the Indians' ceremonial pipe. In smoking the calumet together, the parties to a pact invoked the sun and the other major deities as witnesses, and the pact could not be violated without incurring the wrath of the gods. The most prized of the calumets had bowls of soft red stone found only in a few parts of the north-central United States. More than a century ago, the American painter George Catlin visited the great quarry in Minnesota. The mineral was later named Catlinite, after the artist who had spent so many years among the Indians. His impression of the area was recorded on a page in his sketchbook. In 1840, nearly 6,000 tribesmen were said to have been camped around the quarry, and Longfellow would later write of this place in Hiawatha, telling how the Great Spirit instructed his people to make the first peace pipe. Now a small national monument of 283 acres, it stands apart from the surrounding countryside, guarded by the spirits of 3 young women said to have been buried beneath the great boulders which mark the quarry entrance. Before Catlinite could be removed from this hallowed ground, a sacrifice of tobacco had to be made to the 3 maidens. That tradition is still followed by Indians who come in quest of the stone. Men of the Sioux, the Mandan, and the Blackfoot, the Ojibwe, the Ponca, and others. For 300 years and more, Indians of the plains have stood before these boulders and sought permission to enter.